what I really want to talk about here is well, what about ethics committee and social media? And I want to suggest to you all that what we have in terms of dealing with social media as a society, but also as ethics committees, is really what I would suggest is the moral panic model of ethics. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what a moral panic is and how this actually applies to what we do when we're presented with issues around social media and research with it. The second thing I'm going to raise is the question of what is a human subject, because as a sociologist I'm very interested in the transhuman, cyborg, influences of technology on what humanity means, but I think that social media does raise some interesting questions, because I think as ethics committees we're going to increasingly be asked to decide whether in fact we should be reviewing research on social media and what that should look like. And I'm going to talk specifically about Facebook and the Facebook research which came up and really began a lot of the discussions around ethics and social media. The third thing I'm going to be talking about is what is this thing called privacy, because I think privacy is the one thing that informs absolutely everything around what we understand around social media, and also some of the biggest issues that we have with assessing applications. And I want to suggest that there are some different models of privacy which move away from the largely legalistic and bureaucratic understanding of privacy that we have as ethics committees and in the West, which we probably need to begin shifting when we begin talking about social media and research. And then where to next? I pass the baton over to Bronwyn and sit down comfortably. So that's what I'll be doing for the next 20 minutes or so. What do we mean by the moral panic model of ethics? I would suggest to you all, if you think about what we as committees are, we have four basic characteristics. The first is that we're conservative. Now, this is partly a function of the fact that we're human and humans don't do change well. I'd suggest we do change very, very reluctantly. This is despite the fact we are adapting to change all the time, but nonetheless, when we are asked to make decisions, we tend to go to what has worked before rather than pushing forward out into something which is risky. And I think that we tend to be less inclined as a group to look for alternative models of engagement and solutions to problems. The second thing that is as committees, we're risk averse. And I think that's partly our job. Our job is, after all, to make sure that research doesn't hurt people. But I think that sometimes in being risk averse, what we are actually doing is we are preventing researchers from best practice. And this is particularly true when we're looking at new technologies and new developments. The third thing we are is that we are culturally and socially constructed. As a sociologist of identity, I'm obviously quite big on this, but I believe that we're all social beings, that who we are is defined entirely by our social context. And what this means is that although when we come into the committees we have to do our best to put whatever moral, religious preconceptions beside us, and we have to look at things in as an objective and impersonal way as possible, that's impossible to do. That what we bring in with us are socially constructed prejudices and attitudes towards things, and that as humans it's impossible for us to step aside from that. But as ethicists and as ethics committees and as researchers we need to be aware of it. And the fourth thing is that we are very, very slow to respond to change. Now, a part of this is because a lot of us are housed within universities, and universities, as we all know, are very, very slow to change. They are fairly ponderous machines, and once on a trajectory, it's very, very difficult to turn them around. And that we're also governed by or guided by the National Statement, which is a wonderful framework of guidelines, but unfortunately is also quite difficult to change. The other issue around this is, of course, when you write something down, the act of inscription actually tends to make it quite permanent. So this is one of the great tricks for getting students to talk. As a first-year lecturer, you're always told this. The first thing you do is you get them to write something down and then you ask them to say something. Because what we know is once someone's written something down, they're actually committed to it. And I think the same applies when you have something in a beautifully written with headers and watermarks and all the rest of it. What we do tend to do is stick to it. And this makes us very, very reluctant to change, to embrace change. And this worked reasonably well because, after all, qualitative interviews trudge along more or less in the same format as they always have. A face-to-face interaction is always going to be very much similar. Scientific research, again, although some of the topics are changing, or many of the topics are changing, the same basic processes exist. The difficulty, of course, is that social media and online research and the online world is vastly different. You know, a lot of people talk about the digital natives, so the generation post me, so a lot of our students who are coming through who have grown up never knowing what it means to not have a mobile phone, who are supposedly completely comfortable online. And apparently these are the kids who have actually, you know, embraced change and are fast moving and all the rest of it. And in fact, if you think about it, it's actually the generation 3 or 4 before that, so my grandparents' generation, who have seen the greatest amount of change in terms of technology, who have gone from, if you think about in the last 100 years, seeing the beginnings of private motorised transport to us beginning to look at everyone owning, a large proportion of people owning a car, people not owning telephones in their house, to all of us actually carrying an extremely powerful computer around in our pockets. What we know is that people become out of date very quickly in this kind of technological realm within 5 years. You make a bang immediately, and then within 5 to 10 years, basically you're obsolete and your knowledge is obsolete. So this is problematic as far as research guidelines are concerned, as far as ethics guidelines are concerned. So research, social media in particular is fast changing. It's technologically driven and creative. It evolves in ways which we don't anticipate. Now, this is true of all technology. So, for example, the telephone was originally invented for military purposes, obviously, and then it was popped into people's homes. And what the phone companies complained about, one of the first complaints, was that housewives were using it to talk about mundane household matters. I think this is basically means that you give someone a piece of technology and they will use it and stretch it and create ways of engaging with it in ways that the makers and the originators never anticipated. So what does this mean? It actually means that what we talk about today is going to be out of date by tomorrow. That anyone who has a 15-year-old is probably going to have someone who can program the remote control, and me, I can press 2 buttons on it, it's the on and the off, and the sort of channel changer. The fact is that we need, it's the young people who are using technology in ways which we don't anticipate. And that as ethics committees and as social researchers, in order to keep up, we have to be able to embrace that change. And the other thing about social media is it's novel. That what we are being asked to do as researchers is to engage with this brand new technology in ways that, we're probably a little bit too old to do comfortably. Certainly I feel that I'm too old to do comfortably. But also that our participants don't actually know about. That we don't actually know how they're going to be engaging and what they're going to be doing with it. And so what you have in terms of the setup that we currently have in terms of assessing research is that we have a very, very conservative institutional way of sort of developing research, trying to assess research which is being done, which is inherently changing, inherently moving, inherently fluid. And I'd suggest at this stage what we have is a very, very profound mismatch. And this is why we have the moral panic model. Now, I like Stanley Cohen's definition of what the moral panic is. So the moral panic that Stanley Cohen was writing about was actually about the mods and the rockers. So this is the 1960s youth culture. But what he argues moral panic is that it's a condition or episode or person or group of persons emerging to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests. Its nature is presented in a stylised and stereotypical fashion by the mass media. The moral barricades are manned by editors, bishops, politicians and other right-thinking people, and I would suggest that universities also exist as part of the right-thinking group. Socially accredited experts, that would be us, pronounce their diagnoses and solutions, and ways of coping are evolved, or more often resorted to. The condition then disappears, submerges or deteriorates and becomes more visible. So what we're actually talking about are things which kind of appear in our society that we get very worried about. Now, obviously, one of the big moral panics we've got is obviously right now terrorism, and particularly around sort of the Muslim community. Very, very obvious example. But there are others, and the social media is another one. So the idea about paedophilia, and particularly paedophiles online, is one, online stalking is another. And the online world is an area which people are very, very worried about, very concerned about. The problem with panic is it stifles creative thought and sensible thought. Basically, you put anyone into a situation of panic, rational thought sort of shuts down, and we go into complete survival mode. We act in a very, very reactive way. And the problem we have as a society right now is that most of what we talk about in terms of social media is situated within this moral panic. Terrorists are using social media as a way of communicating with each other. Pedophiles are stalking our children online. Children are being bullied online. And this means that the whole area has become very, very dangerous. It's an area which we treat with great suspicion. And the problem with this is it doesn't actually allow us to sort of develop ways of managing it. And as ethics committees, I think we do need to manage that. The difficulty researchers have is that they're often researching in these areas. They're interested in what's going on. They're interested in engaging and finding out actually how it's all working. But they come face to face with us on the ethics committee going into complete meltdown about the idea that this is a dangerous space that we need to think about and manage and control. Now, moral panics were initially examined in relation to youth culture. I think this is really important. So anyone who's seen that fabulous movie Quadrophenia, I don't know how many of you have. Fabulous movie, all those wing mirrors are just marvellous. But you've also obviously got, which is about the mods and the rockers, great movie. But you've also obviously got punk, which was another area where moral panic emerged. And now, of course, we do have online. And we're particularly worried about our children being online, our young people being online. But of course, what we also know is that anyone who is owned by maybe a teenager knows that it's very, very difficult to prise that little computer out of their hands. In fact, it's very difficult to prise the computer out of sort of anyone's hands. I'd be very surprised if in the break between talks, everyone didn't sort of whip, or some of you don't whip out your phone and just make sure you haven't missed that critical email or Facebook update. It's something which is endemic, okay? And it's something that we're worried about. And I think it's something we need to be aware of when we're talking about this sort of stuff, is that we do have to worry about this. So S argues that actually new technologies are one of the flashpoints around moral panic in today's society. He suggests that there is a deep-seated fear that our new technologies are somehow getting out of control. In part as these new technologies apparently threaten to corrupt our ethical and social sensibilities. So we're worried, we're scared. And I'm not sure how much we need to be. So one thing to think about. The other thing to think about when we're thinking about us as social beings in terms of how social media is presented, first of all, stories are often sensational. You know, we hear a lot about the things that go very, very wrong. Second, they're often sexual, because sexuality and sexual behaviour is another flashpoint as far as social mores and social norms are. How do we interact with each other as sexual beings? They emphasise the risks of the new technology. And there are increasing calls for regulation and control. And you can see this in Australia now. We're actually increasingly giving up all rights to privacy, our ability to actually not be surveyed online, surveyed in terms of the privacy of our own homes, because we're very, very frightened about the possibilities which revolve around new media and social media. And I think that this is something as people belonging to a university we should probably be quite concerned about and we need to engage with. Now, what this results in is ethical thinking which is either or. Either we reject new technologies and research using them as being too risky. When people panic, this is often what we do. We say no, just completely baby and bathwater out. It goes into the too hard basket. Or we give sort of, S suggests wholesale support. I don't think we ever do give necessarily wholesale support, but I think we do piecemeal support. What we do is we allow some research and we allow some engagement, but we actually put so many conditions on top of it that it becomes impossible for researchers to operate within that space. And this results in bad research, which is also unethical. So I think we need a more nuanced approach. We need to actually take a step back from the moral panic. We need to actually engage as rational thinking beings. And this is really, really important because new technologies travel so fast. You know, I'm going to be talking about Facebook, but of course Facebook is something that old people use. It's not something that necessarily young people use anymore. You know, we're trying to be moved on to Yammer at my university. you know, there's wholesale resistance from some staff members and there's sort of wholesale support from others, but eventually we're all going to be on Yammer until the next platform comes along, and then the next platform comes along. Things are moving very, very quickly, and what this actually means in terms of how we engage is that we can't rely on guidelines, because you can't rewrite guidelines fast enough. We need to develop a way of thinking about social media which allows us to be responsive and reactive to what's actually going on, instead of relying on old models. So, what is social media research? Some of you may have stumbled across this. It came up at the start of 2014, but in January 2012, Facebook, in collaboration with academic researchers, ran an experiment which ended up altering people's emotional states. Basically, they manipulated people's news feeds through an algorithm that they use regularly. And this is how you end up getting all the useful ads. So when I look at mine, I get a lot of dog products because I have dogs, and I post a lot about my dogs. So that's sort of what pops up on my feed. So what they did was they used that algorithm and they actually manipulated what appeared on people's news feeds. And so for some people, they got really positive and happy good news stories, which is lovely. And for other people, they didn't. They got quite negative news stories. And what they then did after that was they then analysed the data. And this is really where people ran into trouble, because two academics, after an IRB review, analysed the data and published a paper. Now, Facebook argued that, first of all, what was going on was unknown to the people because it's something they do regularly. They don't necessarily manipulate things to go positive or negative, but certainly what they actually do is manipulate what goes onto your newsfeed. But what really upset people was the involvement of these academics. And the IRB review actually concluded that it was allowed to go ahead because no human subjects were involved. The reason they argue this, and this is why we need to think very carefully about what constitutes human or not, is because the researchers did not see any. They saw basically a collation of data, which was not depersonalised. It was basically the equivalent of health records, which they then analysed using a text-based software, which is actually used a lot in literature. And and what they actually found by doing this analysis was that by altering the content of the news feeds, people's emotional states were in fact altered. The study authors noted that given the massive scale of social networks such as Facebook, even small effects can have large aggregated consequences. So, after all, an effect size of D equals 0.001, which is what they measured, so it's quite small, at Facebook's scale is not negligible. So in early 2013, this would have corresponded to hundreds of thousands of emotion expressions in status updates every day. So these are the things that as researchers, as ethics committees, we need to think about, and we haven't had to before, because these researchers were simply given a data bank of stuff that had already been done, so the impact had already happened, and then they analysed it, and this is what came out. So what we're dealing with is, first of all, data which can be depersonalised. Second, we've got people who are dealing with corporate identities and entities who are not bound by the same ethical principles as academic researchers. And are we going to stop people researching with those people? Probably not, but we need to think about how we're actually going to manage that. And third, the scale. Because frankly, we're talking millions of people who can potentially be influenced. And we don't have the tools to deal with that. The other issues, obviously, are the more general ones: informed consent, opportunity to withdraw, unknown impact on potentially vulnerable participants. We don't actually know if anyone did become hugely depressed as a result of this because we can't contact the people. What are the roles of the academics and what are the roles of the ethics committees? Would, as an ethics committee, you have chosen to allow this to go through? And I think, actually, to be fair, the way it was presented, most of us would have, which is why Harvard did. So we need to then think about what a human subject actually is. Social media data can be analysed as a data set. So the question is, who or what is human? Is an avatar human? How about a character in an online game? Would you consider that to be human or non-human? So I've already got people shaking their heads and smiling, and it's very, very difficult to know which way that's going to fall out. What do we do with data sets that are made available to us? Technology is continuously collecting data and information. what do we do with that information? Do we leave it to one side, or do we actually allow people to access it? And if we allow people to access it, how and what? In this particular instance, doing the further analysis would not adversely impact participants. The analysis itself wasn't going to happen and the collection had already occurred. How do we feel about that? And what do we do about these data sets and the information contained therein? Who owns them? And what access should we have? And really, when do we need to review our applicants and what is our applications and what is our benchmark? At what point do we as an ethics committee get involved? The final thing I want to talk about very, very quickly is privacy. And I would suggest that this is the main basis of most of the other ethical concerns that we have, because privacy is one of those things that's fairly obvious in an offline world, but more difficult to define in an online world. So there are two real options that we can talk about in terms of privacy. The first one is understanding privacy as a continuum. That is, that if you have a strong individual conception of self, as in America, all the way through to a strongly relational conception of self, which really sits in Confucian and Buddhist societies, who you are is actually related either only to who you are as an individual, or who you are is related only to who you are and how you sit in relation to others within your social network. But this will situate you somewhere along the lines in terms of the continuum that I have up there. So the first option is that you have complete individual privacy. Now, individual privacy sort of sits where as an individual I have complete control over absolutely everything about myself, and I get to choose who knows what about me at any given moment. We then sort of shuffle along the continuum to group privacy. And group privacy, I think, is something you're all familiar with, but it's not something that's legally enshrined, and that is that it's the stuff that people know within your intimate circle, and that not allowing people to share that kind of information actually results in you being excluded. But it's something that sort of outsiders don't know about. So if you think about gossip and appropriate gossip and that kind of insider knowledge, that's kind of where that is sort of situated. And then you've got publicly, where you actually sort of sit where there is no privacy at all, that everything about you is kind of open slather. And the difficulty we really have as ethics committees is, first of all, that I think that we tend to sit at the level of individual privacy, right? But I think that social media and social media researchers realistically sit further towards either group privacy or publicly. And so the question we've got is, how do you actually merge the two? The other way we can think about it is to divide privacy into three different areas. First of all, accessibility privacy. This refers to freedom from unwanted intrusion, the right to be let alone or being free from intrusion, which is again where most committees kind of sit, except if you're obviously in a public area. Second is decisional privacy, freedom from interference from others in personal choices, plans and decisions. And the third one is informational privacy, the ability to control the information we consider personal. The difficulty with social media, and as soon as you step online, is all of those three levels of privacy are simply gone, because we do submit them to the corporations and often to the government as one of the conditions that we have for stepping online. And so as ethics committees, we actually really need to think through a lot of these areas around who owns what we have, who owns sort of the information that we give out, and how do we actually respond to researchers and to participants when they're kind of engaging with this sort of stuff. This is also a problem because we have issues which are specific to online areas. First of all, we have greased information, the instantaneous exchange of information and images. This is particularly a problem with things like Snapchat. You've got talking back. Communication online is not one way. It is actually sort of horizontal, that you have participants talking back up, down and sideways. And how do you actually manage that kind of interaction and interplay? And third, as subjects online, we do sign up for voluntary surveillance in our terms and conditions. And so as ethics committees, what do we actually do about that in terms of, are we actually raising an artificially high bar for researchers when our subjects have already largely sort of pushed that to one side?